We must be honest and accurate with reality, which means we must start by being honest and accurate with ourselves. We neither praise ourselves beyond what is true, nor do we condemn ourselves more than we deserve. From there, every time we speak, every word we utter must be weighed carefully.
Drama has followed the Ten Commandments since the beginning. God himself spoke from the top of Mount Sinai with thunder and lightning. The commandments are the only part of Scripture that God himself physically wrote. Down through the ages, the commandments have been the benchmark of morality in Judeo-Christian thought, and today, the displaying of the commandments continues to be a source of controversy and drama. But what are the commandments? These 10 rules important enough for God to personally deliver. Join us on this 12-part journey through the commandments that form the bedrock for what following Christ looks like.
We have seen how the previous 3 commandments are far more complicated than their simple 2 words in Hebrew simplicity would suggest. As Jesus would highlight with murder and adultery, and much of the New Testament would imply with theft, keeping the spirit of those commands goes far beyond simply not committing the legal definition of murder, larceny, or sleeping with a married person. The wordier 9th commandment, unsurprisingly, is more complicated than it would first appear. Now, a literal translation of the 9th commandment would read, "You will not testify against your neighbor a testimony of lies." Often this is smoothed out to, "Do not bear false witness," or colloquially simplified to, "Do not lie." This isn't quite accurate, although Proverbs 16 through 19 does list lying lips as one of the so-called 7 deadly sins. And yet, people in the Old Testament are commended for lying all the time. For example, Tamar lies to Judah to get the baby that she was owed from him. It's a weird story in Genesis 38. The Hebrew midwives in Exodus chapter 1, outright lie to Pharaoh about why they weren't aborting babies, and they're praised for it, blessed for it even. Jael lies to Sisera right before straight up murdering him. God even tells Samuel to lie, or at least tell a half-truth when sending him to anoint David as the next king. And in 1 Kings 22, God sends a lying spirit to entice Ahab to his death. So, is lying wrong or not? Is it always wrong? Now, this question has confounded ethicists perhaps more than any other moral quandary. One of the popular ethical dilemmas tossed around in ethics classes is to picture oneself in Nazi Germany and hiding a Jew. The Gestapo comes to the door and demands if you are hiding a Jew. Do you lie or tell the truth? Surprisingly, the response is actually hotly debated, especially among Christians, many of whom will argue that it is wrong to lie flatly and you must tell the truth and trust God to sort things out. A particularly irritating consequence of this question is the semantic parsing of what exactly constitutes a lie. To use our Nazi example, a real-life instance of this happening, actually, in the book A Thousand Shall Fall, Helene Hazel is confronted with this precise scenario. Again, this is an actual historical event now, not a hypothetical. Now, she was hiding a Jew. She wasn't part of the Jewish underground, but she was kind of pinch hitting here for a moment. But she also believed that lying is wrong and didn't want to lie, even to the Gestapo. So she also knew she couldn't betray the Jew in her charge. So what she does is, according to the book, she opens the door to the Gestapo officers, and instead of directly answering their question of "Are you hiding a Jew?" she said, "You are welcome to search my house." They asked her if she was hiding a Jew 2 more times. She answered the same way each time. Eventually, they left, and the young Jew was able to escape. Did she lie? Well, that depends on how one defines a lie, right? On the one hand, she did not directly state a falsehood, i.e., she did not outright say, "No, I am not hiding a Jew." But on the other hand, she did not say that she was hiding a Jew either. In other words, she didn't speak the truth in answer to their question. Rather, she dodged the question entirely, or to put it another way, she omitted the truth? Is the omission of truth a lie? That's what I was taught. And if so, well then, despite her best efforts, Helene Hazel lied. Is what makes a lie a lie? Lord Colby. Oh, you pathetic pup. This is why you are there. Okay. Is the omission of truth a lie? I was certainly taught so. And if so, then despite her best efforts, Helene Hazel still lied. Is what makes a lie an intent to deceive? But then again, if that's true, she still is guilty of lying. If her intent wasn't outright deception, it was certainly an attempt to obfuscate the truth. Or is a lie simply directly stating an untruth? There's such as, the sky is pink, or there are white tigers in this room. If that is all that a lie is, then perhaps we can say that Mrs. Hazel, in fact, did not lie and managed to save the Jew and keep her conscience clean. But of course, if this is how we define a lie, it creates a multitude of loopholes for deception, which seems to go against the spirit of the commandment. So what do we make of the 9th commandment? How do we follow it? And in doing so, how do we do so? By practicing our love for God and our love for our neighbor. To answer that, let's dive in. One thing I hope you've picked up on as we've worked through the commandments is that the wording is intentional. This is where translations, and especially paraphrasing the commandment, can get us into a bit of trouble. Perhaps nowhere is this more apparent than with the 9th commandment. As I've already mentioned, we often paraphrase this commandment simply to be, do not lie. But that is not actually what the commandment says. Again, the most direct translation is, you will not testify against your neighbor a testimony of lies. Now, when said this way, the commandment sounds less like a statement against general lying and more like a prohibition against perjury specifically. After all, testify, testimony, these sound like legally specific terms. And in ancient Israel, they in fact are legally specific terms. It is important that we start this discussion by understanding why God chose to frame this commandment using legal terms. Although the command goes far beyond simply not committing perjury, we'll get there in a moment, and that shouldn't be surprising if you've been paying attention to the previous several episodes. Now, to understand the commitment, the significance of the legal context of this commandment, we must first understand the fragility of what I will very generously call Israel's legal system. In our world, we have a clearly defined legal system with specific laws, burden of proof, impartial juries, in theory at least, appointed judges, appeal systems, and so on and so forth. All systems of checks and balances to make sure that we live under the rule of law and, in theory, are not subject to the whims of a tyrant. In addition, modern technology gives us access to empirical and impartial evidence, at least theoretically, such as DNA testing, fingerprinting, dental records, blah, 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 blah. Video records as well. And pretty much, like I said, everything is recorded. We aren't as reliant on the notoriously unreliable eyewitness as we were maybe 150 years ago. When we find a murder body, we can do DNA analysis, check traffic cam and security footage, dust for fingerprints, as well as interviewing potential witnesses. We, in fact, saw this play out a few weeks ago with the Luigi Mangioni's murder of Brian Thompson. In ancient Israel, yeah, they had none of that. None of that at all. If they found a body in a field that had been murdered, the best they could do was offer a sacrifice to cleanse the land from violent bloodshed and hope that they didn't have a serial killer on the loose. The only forensic tool that they had at their disposal was if someone had actually witnessed the crime. That was it. Consequently, a person's testimony carried a tremendous, outsized weight. We must also keep in mind that their legal structure. In our legal system, as I mentioned, there are lots of protections for the defendant. Again, you are innocent until proven guilty. While some judges are elected, most are appointed by someone outside the local area. They are supposed to be impartial, and there are safeguards against favoritisms. Judges are supposed to recuse themselves in cases where they have a connection of almost any kind to the defendant or the plaintiff. Similarly, jurors can be dismissed by the defense or prosecution if conflicts of interest are found. Accountability structures are theoretically in place on law enforcement and district attorneys to ensure a fair trial with the submission of evidence subject to scrutiny for legitimacy. You can't just go in and grab something. You have to get a warrant. After all, after all of that, there's an extensive appeal system where everything that has already happened is scrutinized for compliance with the rules and regulations. Sometimes this may seem ridiculous, and it is far from perfect, but the advantages of a bureaucratic legal system like we enjoy prevents one person from accusing another and getting essentially an automatic conviction, at least in theory. Again, we could argue that that still happens from time to time, but it is not how it's designed to work, and frankly, not how it works the vast majority of the time. Again, ancient Israel had none of that. It wasn't until the time of Solomon anything resembling a bureaucratic legal system was in place in Israel, with external magistrates being appointed. And even then, most rural villages relied on the traditional method of handling disputes, which was consulting the head of the family or clan, village elders at the gate, who had absolute authority. And also ridiculous levels of conflict of interest. There are a couple biblical examples of what this looked like. One is the Judah and Tamar story referenced in the previous episode that takes place in Genesis chapter 38. As Judah's daughter-in-law, Tamar, was under his authority. Remember the Beit Av structure we talked about in the commandment on family. When it was discovered that Tamar had gotten pregnant by someone outside the family, or at least in theory, that was the assumption, Judah had the authority to order her execution, which she does before she points out that Judah was the guy who got her pregnant and his hypocrisy. Now, it's important to note what is and isn't in contention here. Tamar's character is what's in question. She is vindicated as being a righteous woman, more or less. Okay? Judah's authority to have her executed, to be judge, jury, and executioner, that is never, ever disputed or censured. Rather, the issue is whether or not Judah made an accurate judgment in the first place. And that gives us an idea of how justice worked in the ancient world. Another example is the ending of Ruth's story, Ruth and Boaz's story. To adjudicate the redemption of Elimelech's land, Boaz and his relative, who's unnamed, go to the gate at Bethlehem, or what passed for a gate in a town that wasn't fortified, and the elders oversaw the mediation. Well, who are these elders? Who are the family heads of a very small village? Most of them were probably related to each other. Theirs was the final word on the matter, and there wasn't an appeals court to go to. Not really. So, to sum up Israel's legal system, there were no juries or impartial judges, certainly not in the villages that only contained a few hundred people at most, nor was there any sort of standard of evidence, except for the need for two witnesses, assuming that the Torah was followed, which that's iffy at best. Speaking of evidence, no such thing as empirical evidence that we would consider empirical evidence existed. The only evidence in almost any case was that of the notoriously unreliable eyewitness. There weren't any safeguards on this evidence, no chain of custody or rules for impartiality. There were no police, and the judges were just the accepted clan leaders and clan or community leaders. Nor was there any system of accountability to make sure the evidence and witnesses weren't faked. In fact, it happened all the time. Neither was there an appeals court, and justice was typically carried out the same day a verdict was rendered. That most crimes carried an irrevocable sentence, like, death, or maiming, like chopping off a hand, can't put that back. Even if one was later to have discovered to have been innocent, oops. Nothing can be done. The entire enterprise relied solely on the personal integrity of the witnesses and the judges involved. That's a lot of pressure to put on sinful human beings. It doesn't take a genius to see how this system could be abused, and it often was. Certainly, if the prophets and Psalms have any sort of merit to them, where most of what they complain about is these types of abuses. In fact, it was likely routinely abused. One of God's chief complaints against the Israelites was the constant manipulation of their legal system by the powerful to profit themselves. A powerful example of this system is a story that we referenced just last episode, the story of Naboth and Ahab. To get Naboth's vineyard for her husband, Queen Jezebel arranged for two witnesses, to publicly accuse Naboth of blasphemy in front of local elders at a banquet. The result was an immediate brief trial, with Naboth getting stoned to death that night. And all it took were two lying witnesses. Judging from the rest of Scripture, it would seem that this kind of kangaroo court was probably the norm rather than the exception. Given the enormous power a testimony could wield in society, quite literally the power of life and death, it is little wonder that God would stress the importance of truthfulness in his core statement of morality. Speaking a testimony of lies got innocent people killed and saved guilty people from what they deserved. It destroyed the very fabric of society, particularly a society that God wanted to build. To have a just and good community, it was paramount that one testified the truth when called upon. Now, of course, Scripture does not restrict the application of this commandment to a courtroom or the ancient Israelite equivalent. Part of the legal system, part of the legal aspect of witnesses was vows and promises, something that we see in ancient literature, Old Testament included. For example, in Genesis chapter 21, an odd episode between Abraham and a group of people called the Philistines, although these are not the same Philistines of David and Saul, Abimelech, their king, tells Abraham not to deal falsely, i.e., lie, same word in Hebrew, with him while making their covenant or their treaty agreement. In other words, when they made the treaty, Abimelech emphasized that he expected Abraham to make the deal in good faith. As witnesses, they sacrificed 7 lambs, essentially making the gods guarantors of that deal. I know I keep stressing this point, but it bears repeating. In a society without any sort of standardized legal system to act as a third-party arbiter, the very function of society entirely depended on someone's word. This is why Scripture emphasizes again and again keeping one's promises. Today, we think nothing of making verbal commitments. If someone tells you that they'll help you move at 8 a.m. tomorrow, the reality is that's a firm maybe. And if they don't show for whatever reason, you'll probably be a little annoyed, but it won't be the end of the world or even the end of the friendship. Unless you have a signed contract in triplicate, notarized, and filed with the appropriate board, my word means practically nothing. Even then, I can probably fight it. But in the ancient world that lacked the modern legal safeguards that we enjoy, if people broke their word consistently, society would quite literally fall apart. Therefore, keeping promises made, especially promises made in the presence of others, was paramount, sometimes to the extreme. This is why Hannah has to give Samuel up, and Elkanah her husband, doesn't argue. She made a vow and therefore had to fulfill it, even if that meant surrendering the child that she had so desperately wanted. This is why Jephthah sacrificed his daughter. As incomprehensible as that action seems to us, in that mindset, breaking a vow made in public, especially a vow made to a god, is far worse a crime than sacrificing a child. And it's worth noting that Jephthah's daughter agrees with this logic. She explicitly tells her father to do what he had vowed because that was more important than her own life. But even with our modern legal practices, perhaps especially because of them, God expects us to keep our word. Throughout the Torah, God stresses that he will hold people accountable for the vows they make, no matter what they are. Jesus doesn't let us off the hook either, stressing that we ought to be very careful with our words. Now, Jesus lived in a culture, in a system much similar to our own. Do not swear by the temple or the God who dwells there, Jesus warns. Instead, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Do not make promises you can't keep, a point James also stresses when he tells us to control our tongues. Do not let your mouth write checks you can't cash. But even more than keeping our word, Scripture stresses that we do not deceive for our own gain. Leviticus 19, where we get our second lens of loving our neighbor, stresses and expounds on this. Starting in verse 11, it says, "Do not steal, do not lie, do not deceive one another, do not swear falsely by Yahweh's name, do not defraud your neighbor, do not hold back wages, do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, do not pervert justice through partiality, do not slander." These are all variations on the same thing. Lying and deception God lumps in with stealing and injustice. Proverbs repeatedly hammers this point home. It talks about how God hates dishonest scales. This is something Proverbs mentions several times. When Jacob becomes God's vessel, his use for deception is hardly praised. Lying for gain is the same thing as stealing, the same thing as fraud, the same thing as perverting justice as far as God is concerned. Speaking on God's behalf without his commission and spreading mistruths is a huge violation of this commandment. Jeremiah in particular ran into false prophets' problems, although it is a ubiquitous throughout both testaments. In fact, the most uses of the Hebrew word for lie that we find in this commandment occur in Jeremiah more than any other book. Almost always in the context of false prophets or lying prophets spreading a message God did not send. One other and perhaps most violated version of breaking this commandment is slander and misrepresentation. Jesus faced the worst of this at his trial when literal false witnesses condemned him to the cross. But also in the Psalms, over and over, the psalmist pleads with God to spare him or her from slanderers and false witnesses. It's a problem. Indeed, Paul addresses gossip and slander among believers more than any other sin. Ironically, this is the sin we probably talk about least from the pulpit. So, the ninth commandment is about far more than committing perjury or making sure we're accurate and on the forms we fill out. It is about being honest, even at our own expense, with reality. Lying, as Scripture teaches, is about using our words to twist reality into something that it is not to protect ourselves. Words have tremendous power to shape reality. For God used words to create the universe. But think about how headlines shape people's perception of an event. This is a rather sordid example that may require a warning at the content warning at the beginning, but it is a powerful example of instances of statutory rape by teachers. If it is a male teacher, the headline invariably reads, as it should, male teacher age X arrested for raping, molesting, assaulting student, followed by his mugshot, which is never flattering. Interestingly, if it is a female teacher, the headline reads, female teacher arrested for sexual relationship with her student, followed by a bikini picture poached off of Instagram or something like that. Now, to be fair to the media, this is a phenomenon that has been picked up by commentators, and thankfully, I think headline makers are starting to kind of figure it out, albeit slowly. But think of how the headlines shape our perception of what actually transpires. The former sounds horrific, as it is. The latter sounds salacious and scandalous, but more exciting and even cool than bad. Yet, it is bad. In reading experiences of boys who've been victimized by female teachers as predators, the psychological effects are horrifying on them. Many of them never able to form meaningful relationships because of the trauma. Yet some people will go even so far as to say how lucky that kid was, and there's even an SNL skit to that effect with Pete Davidson. But what if we change the headline to match the man's? Female teacher arrested for raping, molesting, assaulting student, with an unflattering mugshot attached. Well, that changes our reaction, doesn't it? It changes the perception. Suddenly she goes from this sexy fantasy to the vile predator that she actually is. The boy goes from some lucky stud to the traumatized victim he actually is. That's the power of words. A point the Bible stresses, as we've noticed. What we say, how we present reality, has a real effect on shaping that reality. Far from sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, It is much more perception is reality, and perception is defined by our words. So to keep this commandment, we must be painfully honest with reality, which is quite often unflattering to us. We cannot sugarcoat our condition, especially to ourselves. Indeed, as Jeremiah warns, the heart is deceitful above all else, and therefore has to be scrutinized more than anything else. The person we lie to more than anyone is, of course, ourselves. We don't like the reality that we see, so we deceive ourselves to change our reality. Sometimes we outright lie, hoping that if we say a lie loud enough and often enough, it will become true. Sometimes we use terminological inexactitudes, to borrow a phrase from Winston Churchill. Like the headline, example, we change words to change the perception of reality. Statutory rape, or rape becomes sexual relationship. Killing en masse innocent civilians becomes collateral damage, and so on. Sometimes we exaggerate or we downplay. If we're late to work, we exaggerate the effect of traffic, or we'll do the opposite. We'll downplay the cost. We fail to fulfill a promise, and we convince ourselves it's no big deal, even if the person we promised is now hung out to dry. Or we'll pull an ostrich and pretend that something isn't real altogether. Lies of omission, with all due respect to Helene Hazel, are still in fact lies. Often we do the opposite and lie to make things worse. Cognitive behavioral studies have labels for these, like mind reading or catastrophizing, where we take a small thing that happened to us, like a funny look in the hallway, and turn it into a paralyzing nightmare. I can speak with authority on this as someone who has to deal with this all the time personally. Even if the person that we are now mind reading or catastrophizing didn't even actually notice us and their mind was on something completely unrelated. Or we'll take being late for 5 minutes to work as proof that we are worthless creatures. While we should be on time, absolutely, being late isn't necessarily an indictment of character. The power of words makes bending our reality to suit our advantage at the expense of others very tempting, especially in moments where we have the power to do so. It is easy to use words to warp the truth for self-preservation. Think of Adam and Eve's reaction after God confronted them in Genesis chapter 3. They used their words to try and cast blame on someone else, which ultimately was casting blame on God. While not strictly factually incorrect, the serpent did technically tempt Eve and was made by God, they used their words to attempt to deceive, to preserve themselves, and God was clearly having none of it. Gaslighting is another way. We use our words to manipulate and control others. Rather than accept our faults and listen to others' pain, it is easy for us to use our words to invalidate their experiences and try to make them feel crazy or distrust their own recollection of reality. And yet another person's experiences are valid, as of course are ours. Breaking promises and coming up with excuses for why we didn't follow through on them is another form of lying. God expects us to follow through on our commitments. Full stop. While things do happen from time to time, of course, as Christ followers, it is expected that we make every effort to make sure our words mean something. It's expected that when a Christ follower says that they will do something, that everyone should take that to the bank. When we say we'll do something, people should have perfect confidence that we will in fact do it. And finally, and perhaps hardest of all, is gossip and slander. As I noted, gossip is one of, if not the most discussed sin in the New Testament, and it's pretty heavily discussed in the Old Testament as well. Yet, it is one we almost never discuss today. I don't think I've ever heard a sermon preached on gossip and slander. Maybe I have and I've forgotten it, but they're very, very few. And it's probably because we like it so much. It's not easy to preach on things that we like as bad. I am certainly guilty of it. It is easy to do, and gossip, well, frankly, it's a lot of fun. But God expects us to have nothing to do with that sort of talk. Before we close, I want to stress one point that may seem contradictory. The truth is presented through the lens of loving our God and loving our neighbor, i.e. the victims among us. While we are not to show partiality, the truth can be weaponized as a tool of oppression. Not everyone is necessarily entitled the truth. Think back to our Nazi example. Was the Gestapo entitled to the truth that Mrs. Hazel had a Jew hiding in her house? Certainly not. Of course, had she given the boy up, she would have been guilty of lying anyway, because she had promised to protect him. But the point is, there are rare moments where deception is called for, if only to simply say, I can't tell you that, which God occasionally does allow, and why God allows, in cases in Scripture, lying. Now, these are rare and extreme, but never, ever weaponize the truth or let the truth be weaponized against the victimized and oppressed. That is a gross violation of the second greatest commandment. The ninth commandment is fundamentally about how words matter. We must be honest and accurate with reality, which means we must start by being honest and accurate with ourselves. We neither praise ourselves beyond what is true, nor do we condemn ourselves more than we deserve. From there, every time we speak, every word we utter must be weighed carefully, so that it is not to be spoken in vain. No word is without meaning and power, and once said, it cannot be taken back. There is a reason God often praises silence. We speak the truth, even to our detriment, because nothing is gained in the eyes of God by deceiving, even for the nicest of reasons. Yet, we also never weaponize the truth either, using it as a cudgel to get our way. So may God's Spirit show you the truth of your reality. May the Spirit strengthen you to endure and embrace that truth, disturbing as it may be. May you feel the weight of every word you utter, and may you respect the power of your voice, and so you may speak the truth of God in love into this world.